My name is Rachel Harmon. I'm 34 years old. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon, and from the outside, my life looks completely ordinary: a plant on the windowsill, a coffee maker that runs before my alarm does, a job I actually like, friends who show up when I need them. Normal, quiet, intentional. But here's the thing about quiet lives: sometimes they're not built from luck. Sometimes they're built from survival. I grew up in Clover Falls, Ohio. Population just under 8,000. The kind of town where everyone knows your mother's name before they know yours. And my mother, Diane Harmon, was very well known. She was charming and church-going, and the first one to bring a casserole when a neighbor's husband died. Everyone in Clover Falls loved Diane. Everyone except the people who lived inside her house. Let me paint you a picture of what dinner time looked like in the Harmon household. My mother at the head of the table, perfectly composed, asking Marcus about his day like a morning talk show host, warm, interested, laughing at every word he said. And then turning to me with eyes that cooled 3 degrees and asking why I hadn't finished my homework yet, or why I was slouching, or whether I thought that haircut was really appropriate for a girl my age. Small things. Sharp things. The kind of cuts that don't leave marks you can show anyone. My father sat at the other end of the table and ate his food and watched the wall behind my head. I used to think as a kid that maybe I was imagining it. That maybe I was too sensitive, too dramatic. Words my mother used so often they became part of my internal vocabulary before I was even a teenager. You're too sensitive, Rachel. You're so dramatic, Rachel. Why do you always make everything about you? I absorbed those words the way children absorb everything, completely, without filters, deep into the place where identity forms. By the time I was 15, I had already built a second life entirely inside my own head. A life where I was interesting and capable and worth something. I wrote obsessively, journals, stories, letters I never sent. I read everything I could get my hands on. I spent as many hours as possible outside the house, at the library, at Aline's, anywhere that didn't make my chest tight. And Marcus was the weather system I had to track every single day. When he was in a good mood, I was invisible, which was the best I could hope for. When he was in a bad mood, I was the target, and my mother would watch it happen from across the room and find a way, inevitably, to suggest I had provoked it. He once broke my sketchbook, ripped pages out one by one while I stood there, and my mother told me I shouldn't have left it somewhere he could find it. I was 13 years old. I tell you these things not because I want your pity. Truly, I am past the part of my life where I need people to feel sorry for me. I tell you because I need you to understand the specific weight I was carrying when I finally walked out of that house at 27, and more importantly, I need you to understand what I was walking away from when I went no contact. Because people will always ask, but why completely cut them off? Why so extreme? And the answer is this: it wasn't extreme. It was exact. Surgical. It was me, finally, at 27 years old, understanding that some environments don't improve with time. Some dynamics don't shift with enough patience or enough therapy or enough carefully worded conversations. Some things just are what they are, and the only honest response is to stop pretending otherwise. There was one person who always made me feel like I had it wrong, like maybe the problem wasn't me at all. My grandmother, Alene. Alene was my mother's mother, which used to confuse me deeply as a child. How does someone so warm raise someone so cold? Alene was sharp and funny and stubborn in the best way. She kept butterscotch candies in her cardigan pocket and rose bushes she refused to let anyone else touch. She remembered every small thing I ever mentioned: a book I'd liked, a dream I'd had, a friend I'd argued with, and she asked about those things weeks later like they mattered. Because to her, they did. She once told me, when I was 11 years old and crying at her kitchen table after a particularly brutal dinner at home, "Rachel, the ones who work hardest to dim you are the ones most afraid of your light." I wrote that sentence in my journal that night. I have carried it for 23 years. When I was 27, after one final incident that I am not ready to name yet, something happened that made it clear the situation had crossed a line it could never uncross. I made the decision in the parking lot of a gas station at midnight, sitting in my car with shaking hands and absolute clarity. I drove back to the house. I packed 2 suitcases. I took my journals, my documents, my grandmother's photo from my nightstand. And I drove to Portland without looking back. The first year was the hardest. Not because I doubted the decision, I never doubted it, but because grief doesn't care whether you made the right choice. You can make the right choice and still cry over it for months. I cried in parking lots, in my car on lunch breaks, in the shower on Sunday mornings when the silence had a particular shape to it. But I found a therapist, I found a community, I found, eventually, myself. 7 years, a whole self rebuilt from scratch. And then, on a Thursday night in October, my phone buzzed. Then again. Then again. 43 voicemails, one night, numbers I hadn't seen in 7 years. I sat up in the dark and stared at the screen, and something old moved in my chest. Not fear exactly. Not anger. Something deeper than both. The thing that lives in you when you've spent a childhood learning that love from certain people always comes attached to something dangerous. I put the phone face down on the nightstand. I lay in the dark and I said, out loud to nobody, "You are not who they say you are." I said it until my hands stopped shaking. And then I pressed play. I want you to picture something very specific. It is 1:47 in the morning. My apartment is completely dark except for the small light above the stove that I always leave on. I have left it on every single night for 7 years, because I like knowing there is something steady when I wake up disoriented. The kind of small habit you build when you've spent enough time in chaos. You create your own constants. I am sitting on my kitchen floor. Not on the couch, not at the table, the floor, back against the cabinet under the sink, the cold of the tile coming through my pajama pants, knees pulled up to my chest, phone held in both hands like something that might detonate. I don't fully know why I migrated from the bedroom to the kitchen. I think my body made that decision before my brain caught up. The floor felt honest. The floor felt like the right place to receive whatever was about to come through that phone. If something was going to knock me over, I wanted to already be low. I opened the voicemail app. 43 messages. The first one timestamped 6:12 p.m. The last one 1:23 a.m., which means someone in my family was leaving voicemails while I was asleep. While I was just existing in my quiet Portland apartment, someone back in Clover Falls was picking up their phone in the dark and deciding to reach across 7 years of silence. I press play on message 1. Rachel, honey, it's Mom. I know it's been a while and I know you probably, well, something has happened and we really need to hear from you. Please call me back when you get this. Okay, love you. I sat with that for a moment. Here is what I need you to understand about hearing my mother's voice for the first time in 7 years. It didn't sound like a villain. It sounded like a mother. Soft and slightly breathless and ending on love you like it was the most natural thing in the world. And some ancient, exhausted part of me, the part that spent an entire childhood hopping she would just once sound like that consistently, felt it like a bruise being pressed. That's the trap, that's always been the trap. I pressed play on message 2. Rachel, it's Mom again. I don't know if you got my first message. Please call me, it's about Grandma. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with my mother, and everything to do with Alina. Message 3 came quickly after. Her voice different now, the warmth thinning at the edges like ice going soft right before it cracks. We've been trying to reach you. I understand things have been difficult between us, but this is a family matter and we really need you to respond. 3 messages. That's all it took, 3 messages, to travel the full journey from honey to family matter, from performing love to asserting obligation. I had clocked the shift in under 5 minutes, and honestly the speed of it was almost impressive. Some people change their mask slowly. My mother could do it between sentences. I kept going. Message after message painted a picture of a family unraveling in real time across 7 hours. My mother cycling through every version of herself she had ever used against me with the efficiency of someone working through a checklist. The soft one, the wounded one, the one who just wanted her family together, the one who couldn't understand why I was being so cold during a time of grief. The one who reminded me, gently but unmistakably, that people in this town had noticed my absence over the years. That last one, the subtle public opinion threat, that one I recognized like an old song. She had been playing that particular note since I was a teenager. What will people think, Rachel? How does this look, Rachel? As though my entire worth had always been measured in other people's perception of the family image. Then Marcus. My brother left 6 voicemails, and I want to describe them to you, because they tell you everything you need to know about who Marcus Harmon has always been. Message 1, Rachel, it's Marcus. Call mom. 4 words, the tone of someone delegating a minor inconvenience to an assistant. Message 2, Rachel, seriously, this isn't the time for your drama. Still hadn't mentioned Aliner, still hadn't said anything human, just your drama. My existence, my 7-year absence, my entire decision to protect myself, reduced immediately to drama. Message 3, 4, and 5 escalated in that particular way. Marcus had not loud, not raging, just increasingly cold and clipped, each one slightly more entitled than the last, like a man who was used to waiting being a personal offense. Message 6 was the one that stayed with me. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but Grandma is gone, and we are a family whether you like it or not, and you need to act like it. People are watching, Rachel, just call mom. People are watching. There it was again. The family reputation. The performance. 7 years and 1 death, and the most pressing concern was still how things looked from the outside. I sat on my kitchen floor, and I felt something unexpected move through me, not the grief I'd braced for, not the fear I half expected. Something quieter and steadier. Something that felt almost like confirmation. Then message 38 played. My father. 11 seconds. The quietest voice on the entire recording. Carl Harmon, who had spent my entire childhood watching from the corner of the room and saying nothing, who had turned the volume up on the television more times than I could count. Rachel, it's Dad, I know I don't have the right to ask, but please come home. I pressed pause. I sat in the silence of my kitchen at 2 a.m., and I held those 11 seconds inside my chest, and I let myself feel the full complicated weight of them. Because here is the truth, I am not made of stone. I never was. That voice, those words, that quiet admission that he knew he had no right, it moved something in me that I didn't have a clean name for. But I have learned, through years of work, the difference between being moved and being manipulated, between feeling something and being governed by it. I felt it, I acknowledged it, and then I kept going. I listened to all 43 messages, every single one. Then I sat on that floor until the window started going gray with early morning light, and I texted Dr. Simone 4 words. They found me. Eliner's gone. Her response came at 4:03 a.m. I'm here, breathe, you know what to do. I did know, 7 years of knowing. I booked a flight, I called the attorney, and then I cried for Aliner, deep, clean grief, the uncomplicated kind, until there was nothing left. Then I washed my face. And I got ready to go back. I want to tell you what it feels like to drive back to a place you escaped. It is not dramatic, it is not cinematic. There is no swelling music, no empowering montage of you gripping the steering wheel with a determined jaw. It is just your hands on the wheel, the familiar highway unreeling ahead of you, and your body doing things your brain hasn't authorized yet. Shoulders rising, jaw tightening, breath going shallow somewhere around the county line like your lungs remember where they are even when you wish they didn't. I landed in Columbus on a gray Sunday afternoon and picked up my rental car, a sensible silver sedan that smelled like air freshener and other people's journeys. I had a carry-on, a tote bag, my laptop, and a folder of documents Patricia Cole had emailed me the night before. Patricia was my attorney. Not Mr. Marsh, Eliner's attorney, my own. Hired the moment the estate situation became clear. Found through a recommendation from Dr. Simone, who knew I was going to need someone sharp and unintimidated. I drove the 47 minutes to Clover Falls with the radio off. I need you to understand what that silence was like, not peaceful silence, loaded silence, the kind that has a texture. Every mile marker I passed was a memory I hadn't chosen to revisit. The exit where my school bus used to turn. The overpass where Marcus once threw my backpack over the railing on a dare and laughed while I climbed down the embankment to get it. The water tower on the edge of town, with the name of Clover Falls painted in fading letters like a warning or a welcome, depending on who you were when you left. I was someone different now, I kept reminding myself of that. Same road, different woman. I had booked a room at the Route 9 motel, the kind of place with an ice machine in the hallway and curtains that block out all light, which honestly suited me perfectly. I was not staying with family. I was not staying near family. I had a room with a deadbolt and a coffee maker, and absolutely no obligation to explain myself to anyone before 9 a.m. That felt like luxury. Monday morning, I drove to Gerald Marsh's office on the town square. He was exactly what a small-town estate attorney should look like, gray-haired, unhurried, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead like they lived there. He offered coffee. I accepted. He opened a folder and set it on the desk between us, and then he quietly, methodically, dismantled every assumption I had walked in with. Eleanor had updated her, 14 months before she died. I want you to sit with that timeline for a moment. 14 months. Which means that while Eleanor was still alive, while she was still pruning her roses and keeping butterscotch candies in her pocket and calling me on random Tuesdays, she was also sitting across from Gerald Marsh in this very office, deliberately and methodically restructuring her entire estate. She knew what she was doing. She knew exactly what she was doing. My mother Diane received one item, a pearl bracelet she had always openly admired, the kind of gift that is technically generous and emotionally devastating in equal measure. Marcus received $5,000 and my grandfather's workshop tools. Carl received a handwritten letter that Mr. Marsh had already delivered privately. And I received everything else. The house, the 4 acres it sat on, a savings account containing $312,000, built quietly and carefully over 30 years in a separate financial institution under Eleanor's maiden name, a detail so deliberate it made my attorney actually pause when I told her later. The antique furniture, the rose garden. A small parcel of land on the east edge of town Eleanor had purchased in 1991, for almost nothing, and which had tripled in value as the town slowly expanded toward it. I stared at the papers on Mr. Marsh's desk, and the room went very quiet around me. He waited. He had the patience of someone who had delivered news like this before and understood that the right response was simply stillness. After a long moment I said, "She never told me any of this." He nodded slowly. "She was very specific about that. She said, and I'm quoting her directly here, that if you had known, your mother would have found a way to access it before Eleanor was no longer here to protect it." He paused. She used the word protect, deliberately. Something moved through my chest that I couldn't immediately name. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Cream-colored, my name on the front in Eleanor's handwriting, small, slightly slanted, the letters pressed firmly into the paper the way she pressed into everything she did. Certain, unhurried, permanent. "She asked that you read this privately," Mr. Marsh said. "There's no rush. Take whatever time you need." I thanked him. I shook his hand. I walked out of that office and sat in my rental car in the small parking lot behind the town square, and I held the envelope in both hands for a long moment before I opened it. Eleanor's letter was 4 pages long, written front and back in that same firm handwriting. I am not going to share every word because those words belong to me. They are the most private thing I own, more private than any journal, more precious than anything in that estate. But I will tell you the shape of what she said, because I think you need to understand who Eleanor Harmon was. She told me she knew, not suspected, knew, about my mother's behavior, about my father's silence, about the specific incident that ended everything. She had known for years, and she had carried the guilt of that knowledge like a stone in her chest every single day. She explained that fighting Diane directly had felt impossible, that Diane was her daughter, and that the particular paralysis of loving someone who causes harm is something that doesn't have a clean solution. She did not make excuses for herself. She named it plainly as a failure, and she apologized for it without asking me to forgive her. And then she told me what she had done instead. 14 months of quiet, careful, deliberate preparation. The savings account restructured. The will updated. Mr. Marsh sworn to contact me privately before the family learned the details. Documents gathered and organized and stored in a box in her sewing room labeled with my name. She had built a fortress around me from the inside. At the very end of the letter, in handwriting that pressed a little harder into the page, as if she wanted to make sure it lasted, she wrote. I know I should have been louder when you were small, and I am sorry, Rachel. I am truly sorry. But I have tried to be loud in the only way I had left. Use this well. Use it for something that matters. And don't you dare feel guilty for a single second of it. I folded the letter carefully. I held it against my chest. And I sat in that parking lot for a very long time. Eleanor had known. Eleanor had been planning. And somewhere in the last 14 months of her life, while my family thought she was just getting older and smaller and easier to manage, she had been arranging everything. My grandmother had left me more than money. She had left me the truth, documented, notarized, and waiting. And my family had absolutely no idea what was sitting in those boxes. I want to tell you something about preparation. I had spent the entire drive from the motel to Eleanor's house that morning doing what Dr. Simone calls grounding work. Breathing exercises, nomming 5 things I could see outside the windshield, reminding myself of specific concrete facts. I am 34 years old. I have a life I built myself. I have an attorney. I have documentation. I am not the child who lived in this house. I am a visitor. I am in control of how long I stay and when I leave. I had done everything right. And still, when I turned onto Eleanor's street and saw that house sitting at the end of the familiar driveway, white siding and green shutters, and the rose bushes along the front porch that Eleanor had planted the year I was born, my throat closed in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the body's long and inconvenient memory. The body remembers what the mind has processed. That is the part nobody warns you about. I sat in the driveway for 60 seconds. I counted them. Then I picked up my bag, got out of the car, and walked to the front door. My mother opened it before I could knock. Of course she did. Diane Harmon was wearing a navy blue dress and her church cardigan and the pearl earrings she saved for occasions she considered important. Her hair was done. Her lipstick was on. She looked like a woman who had been ready and waiting, which she absolutely had been, probably since before I landed in Columbus. And before I could say a single word, before I could establish any kind of footing, she crossed the threshold with her arms open wide and pulled me into a hug I had not agreed to. She smelled like gardenias. That specific detail, the perfume, the exact same perfume she had worn my entire life, hit me somewhere behind my sternum like a small, precise missile. Some smell memory from childhood that bypassed every rational thought I had prepared and landed directly in the part of me that was still, underneath everything, a daughter who had wanted a mother. For 1/2 second, just one, I felt the pull of it. The seductive, exhausting, lifelong pull of wanting her to be different than she was. Then she pulled back, held my face in both hands, looked me directly in the eyes with an expression she had perfected over decades, warm, relieved, slightly wounded around the edges, and said, I knew you'd come home. Family always comes back to family. And just like that, the pull was gone. Not I missed you, not I'm sorry for the years, not even thank you for coming, just I knew you'd come. Delivered like a point scored, like a prediction confirmed. Like my presence here was not something I had chosen but something that had simply happened to her, the way she had always treated my entire existence, as something that orbited around her. I stepped inside. Marcus was standing near the fireplace with his wife Dana, who offered me the particular smile of someone who has heard one side of a story for so long they've forgotten there is another side. Marcus did the thing, the half hug, the shoulder pat, the voice pitched 2 notches too loud and too easy, the way people perform normalcy when they're nervous underneath it. Ratch, good trip, you look good, tired but good. 7 years, a whole rebuilt life. New city, new career, new self. And Marcus Harmon looked at me for the first time in 7 years and managed, in one breath, to acknowledge my existence and undercut it simultaneously. Some people are genuinely talented. My father was sitting in Eleanor's armchair in the corner of the living room. The same armchair Eleanor used to read in, the one with the worn patch on the right armrest where she rested her hand. He looked older, not dramatically, not suddenly, but in the way people age when you haven't seen them in a long time and the accumulation hits you all at once. Smaller somehow, like something had been slowly leaking out of him for years. When our eyes met, something moved across his face that I still don't have an exact word for. Not guilt, not relief, something older and more complicated than either. He stood up slowly, the way men his age stand when their knees don't cooperate, and he said my name. Just Rachel. One word. The way you say a word when there are 1,000 words behind it and none of them are ready to come out. I nodded. He sat back down. We left it there. We gathered in the living room and the performance began, and I used that word deliberately because that is exactly what it was. My mother orchestrating the conversation with the skill of someone who had been managing appearances her entire life. She talked about Aliner's final weeks, her voice dipping into the appropriate registers of grief at the appropriate moments. She talked about how the family had struggled with the loss. She used the word we approximately 40 times in 15 minutes. We have been so devastated. We have been hoping you'd reach out. We just want things to be right between us. And I noticed, with the clarity that 7 years of therapy gives you, that not once in any of those sentences was I a separate person with my own experience. I was always already folded back into the we, already absorbed, already returned to the family unit, as though I had simply been temporarily misplaced, rather than deliberately, necessarily gone. Then she made her move. It came wrapped in softness the way her moves always did, a long sigh, a meaningful look around the room, a hand pressed briefly to her chest. I just think, and I mean this from a place of love, that whatever Aliner decided, we should think about what feels right as a family, about what she would have wanted for all of us. Equally. Equally. There was the word, small and reasonable sounding and carrying an entire agenda inside it. She wasn't asking me to consider Aliner's actual wishes, she was asking me to override them. To replace what Aliner had deliberately, legally, and specifically decided with what Diane Harmon preferred. And she was asking me to do it under the banner of love and family unity, so that if I declined, I would be the one who didn't love enough. The one who wasn't a team player. The one causing division. I had watched this mechanism my entire childhood, the request wrapped in the language of togetherness. The guilt preloaded into the framing. Say yes and be absorbed. Say no and be the villain. I looked at my mother. I looked at Marcus leaning forward slightly, watching me with the expression of someone waiting for a transaction to complete. I looked at Dana examining her fingernails. I looked at my father staring at the carpet like it contained an answer he'd been searching for his entire life. And I said, pleasantly and without any heat whatsoever, I think we should let the will speak for itself. That's what Grandma wanted. The room temperature dropped 4 degrees. My mother smiled, but her eyes went still in the way eyes go still when the smile is only happening on the surface. Marcus sat back. Something shifted in the air, not explosive, not dramatic. Just the acknowledgement, unspoken but understood by everyone present, that I was not the person they had prepared for. I changed the subject to Aliner's rose garden. And inside, underneath the calm, behind the pleasant voice and the steady hands, something that had been wound tight in my chest for 34 years quietly, finally released. They had expected the girl who left. They got someone else entirely. I want to tell you about the specific silence of an empty house that belonged to someone you loved. It is different from ordinary silence. It has weight and texture and a particular quality of stillness that feels almost inhabited, like the person is just in the next room, just around the corner, just about to call your name. Aliner's house had that silence in every room. In the kitchen where her kettle still sat on the same back burner she always used. In the hallway where her reading glasses were folded on the small table by the coat rack, as though she had just set them down for a moment and would be back for them shortly. In the guest room where I slept, where her spare cardigan still hung on the back of the door and smelled, faintly but unmistakably, like her. I stayed in that house for 2 weeks. I told myself it was practical, the estate required attention, there were contractors to meet, documents to review, rooms to assess. And all of that was true. But the deeper truth, the one I admitted to Dr. Simone on one of our nightly calls, was simpler and more human than practicality. I just wanted to be near Aliner for a little while longer. In her space. Among her things. I wanted to make tea with her kettle, and sit in her kitchen chair, and exist inside the life she had built. Because being inside it felt like still being close to her, in some way, I wasn't ready to let go of yet. On the 3rd day, I started going through the rooms methodically. Most of what I found was ordinary and tender in equal measure, the way going through any beloved person's belongings tends to be. Photograph albums organized by decade with Alina's small captions, written beneath each picture in her firm handwriting. Holiday decorations wrapped carefully in tissue paper and stored in labeled boxes. A recipe box stuffed with handwritten cards, some of them so old the ink had faded to near invisible, the paper soft as fabric from decades of handling. I worked through the living room, the bedroom, the hallway closet, the kitchen cabinets. And then on the third afternoon, I came to the small back bedroom, the sewing room, the one that smelled like cedar and old fabric, and the particular dusty sweet smell of a room that is used for keeping things rather than living in them. There were boxes stacked along the back wall, neatly arranged, each one labeled in Alina's handwriting. Most of the labels were what you'd expect. Tax records 2010-2015, Christmas decorations, photo albums, school years, Gerald's things. Gerald was my grandfather, gone since I was 6, and there was a whole section of boxes dedicated to his belongings that Alina had clearly never been ready to part with and had simply archived with characteristic practicality. I was working my way through the stack when I saw it. One box slightly apart from the others. Not hidden, Alina wasn't hiding it, I don't think. She had positioned it where she knew I would find it when I went through her things. Because Alina knew me, she knew I would come, she knew I would be thorough. She had counted on both those things. The label was different from all the others. One word, capital letters. Precise and deliberate, the way everything Alina did was precise and deliberate. Rachel. I sat down on the floor of that sewing room, and I just looked at it for a moment. My name on a box in my grandmother's handwriting in a room I had known since childhood. Something about it felt enormous and intimate simultaneously, like receiving a letter that had been traveling toward you for years and finally arrived. I opened it carefully. And what I found inside quietly, methodically, permanently rearranged everything. The first layer was the letters and cards, every single one I had ever sent Alina, going back to when I was 7 years old and had learned to write in careful, oversized print. Birthday cards with crayon drawings. Christmas cards. Random notes I had mailed from Portland during the years of no contact, knowing that Alina was the one person whose address I had kept, the one thread I had maintained across the silence. She had kept every single one, organized by year, held together with rubber bands, each bundle sitting in chronological order like chapters. I picked up the earliest one, a birthday card I had made by hand at age 7, construction paper folded in half, a drawing of roses on the front, because even then I knew Alina loved roses. Inside, in enormous careful 7-year-old handwriting, Happy Birthday Grandma. I love you the most. Love, Rachel. I held that card for a long time. Beneath the cards were photographs I had never seen, candid ones, the kind nobody poses for. Me at Alina's kitchen table doing homework, age maybe 10, tongue slightly out in concentration. Me and Alina at the county fair, me holding a paper cone of pink cotton candy, both of us laughing at something just outside the frame. And one photograph that stopped me completely, Alina holding me as a newborn, sitting in the hospital chair, looking down at my face with an expression I can only describe as recognition. Like she already knew me, like she had been waiting for me specifically. I set the photographs aside carefully and kept going. Beneath them were the folders. The first one was labeled Financial, D, and when I opened it, I found bank statements spanning 11 years. Page after page of transactions, each one annotated in Alina's handwriting in the margins, small, precise notes that told the full story without editorializing. Transfer after transfer from Alina's account. $500 here, $800 there, $1,200 on a random Tuesday in February. $40,000 over a decade, documented meticulously, each one labeled in Alina's notes with the same 2 words, Diane asked. Not borrowed, not loaned, just asked. And Alina had given, quietly, repeatedly, without telling anyone. While my mother presented herself to Clover Falls as a capable, self-sufficient woman who had raised her family admirably, she had been quietly, regularly taking money from her elderly mother for over a decade. Money Alina had saved carefully over 30 years. Money that had been intended for something else entirely. I set that folder down and picked up the second one. This one was labeled Correspondence. and it contained printed emails and text message screenshots going back 8 years. My mother writing to Alina in the careful language of a person who knows how to apply pressure while maintaining plausible deniability. Message after message attempting to reshape Alina's perception of me, painting my absence as cruelty, my no contact as abandonment, my self-preservation as selfishness. And woven through all of it, subtle and persistent, the campaign to separate Alina from me entirely. To convince an elderly woman that her granddaughter had simply stopped loving her. Alina's responses were short, consistent, immovable. One of them, sent on a Sunday morning, 3 years ago, said simply and with absolute finality, "Diane, she is my granddaughter and I will love her until I am in the ground. Do not ask me again." I read that sentence 4 times, then I read it a 5th. The third folder was the one that sat the heaviest in my hands. It was labeled with a date, the exact date of the incident, the night that ended everything. Inside was a document written entirely in Alina's handwriting across 3 careful pages. Detailed, specific, names, dates, the sequence of events as Alina had pieced them together from what she had been told and what she had witnessed in the years leading up to that night. At the bottom, 2 signatures. Alina's own, and beside it the signature of her neighbor Margaret Chu, a retired notary public who had lived 3 houses down for 30 years. My grandmother had documented what happened to me. She had it witnessed. She had it notarized. She had kept it in a box with my name on it in a room she knew I would eventually enter. She had known that Marcus might challenge the will. She had known that Diane might make claims. She had known that the only way to truly protect me was to build a case from the inside, quietly, over years, so that when the moment came, when I was finally standing in that sewing room, finally home, finally ready, I would not be standing there empty-handed. I closed the third folder and sat very still on the floor of Alina's sewing room and breathed through the particular feeling of being simultaneously devastated and held. Of understanding that someone had loved you that carefully for that long without ever making it about themselves. Then I picked up my phone and called Patricia Cole. I said, "Patricia, I need you to look at some documents." She said, "Send them over." I looked out the sewing room window at Alina's rose garden, slightly overgrown, slightly wild, stubbornly beautiful in the gray October afternoon. I said, "I also need to know, if someone were to contest this will, what would a notarized, witnessed account of misconduct do to their case?" There was a pause on the line. Then Patricia said, with the calm certainty of someone who has never once in her career lost a case she believed in, "It would end it." I nodded to nobody in particular. Then I went and made tea with Alina's kettle. And I started making plans. I want to tell you something that took me a long time to understand. Revenge, real revenge, the kind that actually means something, is not loud. It is not a confrontation in a doorway with the perfect speech you rehearsed in the shower. It is not a screaming match or a slammed door or a dramatic exit that everyone witnesses. Those things feel satisfying for approximately 4 minutes, and then they leave you with shaking hands and a racing heart, and the other person gets to walk away calling you unstable, which is exactly what they wanted. Real revenge is quieter than that. Real revenge is a woman sitting at her dead grandmother's kitchen table at 7 in the morning with a cup of tea and a legal folder, and the absolute unhurried certainty that every single thing she is about to do is already won. That is where I was. Let me walk you through what the next 2 weeks actually looked like, because I want you to understand that none of it was impulsive. None of it was emotional in the reactive sense. Every single thing I did was measured and deliberate and executed with the kind of calm that only comes when you have spent 7 years building yourself into someone who cannot be rattled by the people who used to rattle you daily. The first thing I did was the locks. Tuesday morning, 8 o'clock. A locksmith from the next town over, not Clover Falls, because in Clover Falls everyone knows everyone and I didn't need my mother hearing about this before noon. New locks on every exterior door. New deadbolts. 2 sets of keys, one for me, one couriered directly to Patricia's office in Columbus. I texted my mother from the driveway while the locksmith was still finishing up. No preamble, no apology, no softening language. Just the property has been legally secured. Any access requires advance written notice and my explicit permission. Rachel, formal, factual, completely inarguable. I stood by my rental car and watched the 3 dots appear on my phone indicating she was typing. They appeared and disappeared 4 times. She never sent anything. That silence told me everything. The second thing involved Marcus's furniture. He had been storing pieces in Aliner's garage for years: an old sectional sofa, a dresser, several boxes of miscellaneous belongings he had never collected despite having a perfectly functional house of his own 20 minutes away. People like Marcus store things in other people's spaces because it gives them a reason to keep coming back. A foot in the door, literally. I recognized it for what it was. I sent a formal written notice to his last known address and his email, Patricia's suggestion: always document everything, stating that uncollected items would be donated after the legally required notice period. He did not respond. Not in writing, not with a phone call, not with any acknowledgement whatsoever. Marcus Harmon, who had left 6 voicemails in one night demanding I act like family, could not manage a single reply to protect his own belongings. The notice period expired on a Thursday afternoon. Friday morning, I called the Clover Falls Women's Transitional Shelter, a small organization I had found while researching the area, quietly underfunded, quietly essential, and arranged a donation pickup for the following Monday. The woman who coordinated the pickup, a soft-spoken woman named Beverly, told me they had been desperately short on furniture for months, that they had women sleeping on air mattresses because they didn't have enough beds. I stood in Aliner's garage and looked at Marcus's sectional sofa and felt something that was not quite guilt. It was close, but it wasn't guilt. It was more like symmetry. Marcus's furniture, which he had stored in Aliner's space for years out of entitlement and convenience, was now going to furnish beds for women who needed somewhere safe to sleep. I found that arrangement deeply, profoundly appropriate. The legal challenge arrived on a Thursday. I had been expecting it, not hopping for it, not dreading it, just expecting it the way you expect rain when the clouds have been building for days. Marcus, through an attorney in Columbus, filed a formal contest claiming Aliner had lacked testamentary capacity at the time the will was updated, which is the legal language for claiming the person wasn't mentally competent when they made their decisions. Testamentary capacity. Aliner, who had spent 14 months in quiet, methodical, strategically layered preparation of that exact will. Aliner, who had documented everything, organized everything, had it notarized and witnessed and stored with deliberate precision. Aliner, whose letter to me was 4 pages of lucid, specific, emotionally coherent writing that demonstrated more clarity of mind than most people manage in the best years of their lives. Testamentary capacity. I actually laughed. Alone in Aliner's kitchen, at 7 in the morning, I laughed out loud at the audacity of it. Then I called Patricia. She filed the response within 48 hours. The notarized incident documentation. The financial records showing the $40,000 in transfers from Aliner to Diane, directly relevant to the question of who had been exerting influence over whom in that family. The correspondence folder showing my mother's years-long campaign to separate Aliner from me. All of it, organized, indexed, devastating. I want you to understand what that documentation meant in legal terms. It didn't just defend the will, it told a story. A very specific, very well-evidenced story about a family dynamic in which one person had been systematically manipulated and one person had been systematically protected, and Aliner had been the quiet architect of that protection for over a decade. Contesting the will didn't just risk losing, it risked making all of that story public record. Within a week, Marcus's attorney made quiet contact, suggesting they might be open to withdrawing the challenge in the interest of keeping things civil. Patricia told them we would discuss civility once the challenge was withdrawn completely, unconditionally, and in writing. It was withdrawn by Friday afternoon. I was eating tomato soup at Aliner's kitchen table when Patricia's email came through with the confirmation attached. I read it twice. Then I closed the laptop and finished my soup. No celebration, no phone call to anyone to announce it, no triumphant moment. Just soup, Just the ordinary Tuesday afternoon sound of a house settling around me, and the distant sound of Aliner's neighbors' wind chimes, and the knowledge, quiet and solid and entirely sufficient, that it was done. That same week, I sat down with Jerome Watts, a nonprofit development consultant in town, who Aliner had apparently spoken to before she died, mentioning in passing to her neighbor that she hoped I might do something meaningful with the property. Jerome was patient and practical and genuinely passionate about the kind of work I was describing, and we spent 3 days at Aliner's kitchen table designing something together. The plan took shape slowly, and then all at once the way good plans do. 6 beds, a communal kitchen, a library built from Aliner's own book collection, a small garden maintained, productive, peaceful, on-site case management, partnerships with 2 counseling practices, one of which offered pro bono hours specifically for residents, a community room with Aliner's furniture, her reading chairs, her lamps that made everything look warmer than it was. Named because there was only ever one name it could have been, the Aliner House. I filed the nonprofit paperwork on my last Thursday in Clover Falls, sitting at Aliner's kitchen table, with her kettle steaming beside me and her roses visible through the window, October tired but still standing. One more thing happened before I left. My father appeared at the end of Aliner's front walk on my last morning. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something and then forgotten it, standing there in his jacket with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ground and then at me, and then at the ground again. He said, "I know I don't deserve anything from you." I didn't say anything. He said, "I just wanted you to know that I know what I did, what I didn't do." A pause, his voice very quiet and very steady and completely without self-pity, which was the one thing that made me actually listen. There's no excuse for it. I stood next to my rental car in Aliner's driveway in the October morning, and I felt the full weight of it, every silent dinner, every turned-up television, every moment he had watched and said nothing. And I said, "I know, Dad." Not forgiveness, not absolution, not an invitation, just acknowledgement. Just, "I hear you saying this, and I am choosing to receive it without cruelty even though I don't owe you that." He nodded once, he walked back inside. I got in the car. I drove to the airport. I went home. And behind me, in Clover Falls, Ohio, in Aliner's house, with Aliner's books on the shelves and Aliner's roses in the garden, something was already being built. Something that would matter. Something that was never going to be taken from me. I want to tell you what it feels like to return to your real life after something like that. You land at the airport and you collect your bag from the carousel and you get into your car and you drive the familiar route back to your apartment, and everything looks exactly the same as when you left: the coffee maker on the counter, the plant on the windowsill, the blanket folded over the arm of the couch exactly where you left it. Everything identical. Everything ordinary. And you are completely, fundamentally different. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way anyone else would necessarily see, but inside, in the place where you carry your understanding of yourself, something has shifted with the permanent, irreversible quality of a bone that has healed differently after a break. You are the same person. You are also not. Both things are true simultaneously, and you just have to learn to live inside that contradiction. I dropped my bag at the door, made tea, sat on my couch, and stared at my plant for a long time. Then I called Dr. Simone and talked for 90 minutes. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, my mother had started calling. I want to be precise about the timeline here because I think it matters. The legal challenge collapsed on a Friday afternoon, and my mother's first call came the following Tuesday morning. 4 days. Which tells you everything you need to know about what the calls were actually about. They were not about missing me. They were not about repairing a relationship. They were about the fact that the plan had failed and someone needed to find another angle, and that someone, as always in the Harmon family, was Diane. The first few calls came every other day. I watched them come in from across the room like weather, the phone screen lighting up, her name appearing, the vibration moving across the coffee table, and then silence as it went to voicemail. I didn't block her. I want to be clear about that choice because it was deliberate and considered. Blocking her would have been reactive. Watching her calls pile up unanswered was something else entirely. It was the quiet, patient exercise of a boundary that didn't need to explain itself. I had reactivated a number for the estate business that she apparently still had. I made a note to change it once the paperwork was finalized. The calls increased in frequency as the weeks passed. Every other day became every day. Every day became twice a day. My phone became a kind of scoreboard I checked with the detached interest of someone monitoring a situation they are no longer inside of. The voicemail counter climbed. 8, 14, 22. Meanwhile, in Clover Falls, things were moving. The Aliner house renovation had begun in November. Jerome sent me weekly updates with photographs. The contractors had started with the structural work first, reinforcing the old bones of Aliner's house before touching anything cosmetic, which felt metaphorically appropriate in a way I chose not to examine too deeply. I reviewed every decision from Portland, video called Jerome on Sunday evenings, approved paint colors and furniture arrangements and garden plans, with the focused attention of someone building something that actually matters. Aliner's rose bushes had been properly pruned by a woman named Carla who had been tending gardens in Clover Falls for 20 years. Jerome sent me a photograph of them in late November, cut back for winter, bare and architectural against the gray sky, but healthy, ready, waiting for spring with the particular patience of things that know they will bloom again. I had that photograph printed and put it on my refrigerator. Around the same time, word began spreading through Clover Falls the way word always spreads in small towns, not through announcement or confrontation, but through the slow, unstoppable movement of truth through a community that had known everyone involved for decades. People who had been Aliner's neighbors, her church friends, her library companions, people who had watched quietly for years began talking. Not loudly, not publicly, just in the way people talk when something they suspected has finally been confirmed. Beverly from the women's transitional shelter mentioned to someone that a significant furniture donation had come from the Harmon estate. The attorney's office, through entirely legal and routine public record processes, made the broad outlines of the estate disposition available. 2 women from Aliner's church circle apparently told 3 other women from Aliner's church circle what they had observed about the family dynamic over the years, and those 3 women told others, and the particular geometry of small-town information spread did the rest. My friend Cassandra, the journalist, had been following the estate story since our initial conversation. She reached out carefully in December asking whether I would be willing to speak about family estrangement and inheritance disputes for a piece she was developing. Nothing identifying, no names, no specific locations, just the shape and pattern of a dynamic that she had found was far more common than people acknowledged publicly. I spent a week thinking about it. I talked to Patricia, she reviewed the parameters and confirmed there was no legal risk. I talked to Dr. Simone, she asked me the right questions about my motivations and helped me make sure I was doing it for the right reasons and not from a place of residual anger that would leave me feeling hollow afterward. The right reason, when I found it, was simple. I thought about the 6 beds in the Aliner house. I thought about Beverly telling me they had women sleeping on air mattresses. I thought about every young woman who had ever sat in a car in a parking lot at midnight trying to decide whether what was happening to her was real enough to leave over. I thought about the fact that the most dangerous thing about the kind of damage my family did was how invisible it was, how it happened in the spaces between things, in the silences and the whispers and the turned-up televisions, in the ways that left no marks you could show anyone. I said yes to Cassandra. The piece ran on a Thursday in January. It was careful and well-researched, and it named no one directly. But it described a pattern: the parentified scapegoat, the golden child, the enabling bystander, the weaponized elderly relative, the contested inheritance, with enough specificity that anyone in Clover Falls who needed to recognize the shape of it recognized it completely. I know this because Jerome texted me the morning it ran and said simply, "The phone at the shelter has been ringing all day. Good ringing." My mother's calls accelerated after that. I watched the voicemail counter with the same calm detachment I had been practicing for weeks. 29, 35, 39, each number landing with less weight than the one before it, which is itself a kind of victory, the gradual decrease in the power a person's desperation has over you. And then one rainy Wednesday evening in late January, I picked up my phone to check the time, and I looked at the notification properly for the first time in weeks. 43 new voicemails. I sat very still. I thought about a Thursday night in October, a kitchen floor, a girl sitting in the dark with her back against the cabinet under the sink, holding a phone in both hands like something that might detonate. I thought about what it had felt like to hear that number for the first time, the way it had landed in my chest, with the weight of 7 years of silence suddenly broken. And now here it was again, the same number, from the same family, but everything else was different. I was not on the floor. I was on my couch in my apartment, in my city, in my life, the life I had built from scratch out of $1,400 and 2 suitcases and the stubborn, unbreakable decision to survive. I was not afraid. I was not even particularly sad. I was just present, steady, myself. I screenshotted the notification. I sent it to Dr. Simone with one single emoji, face with tears of joy. She responded in 30 seconds with the same one back. Then I put my phone face down on the coffee table and picked up the renovation proposal Jerome had sent me earlier that week. The plans for the communal garden, the layout of the raised beds, the specific varieties of roses Carla had recommended for the front border of the Aliner house. I did not listen to a single voicemail. Not one. Not because I was performing strength or making a point or waiting for someone to notice how unaffected I was, but because there was genuinely, completely, nothing in those messages that I needed. Whatever my mother was saying, the pleading, the pressure, the guilt, the obligation, whatever combination of her greatest hits she had assembled across 43 attempts, it had no purchase on me anymore. The leverage was gone. The estate was secured. The documentation existed. The nonprofit was filed. The Aliner house was being built. She was leaving voicemails into a void. And I was reading about roses. Marcus, from what I gathered through occasional updates from Jerome and one brief mention from Mr. Marsh, relocated to Arizona with Dana sometime in February. He made no public statement about the failed legal challenge. He did not contact me directly. He simply left. Which was, honestly, the most dignified thing he had done throughout the entire situation, and I noted it without malice. My father did not call again after the driveway conversation. I thought about that sometimes, the 11-second voicemail, the driveway, the 4-page letter that arrived in Portland 6 weeks after I returned home. I had read that letter once, in one sitting, and then put it in the drawer of my nightstand where it remained. I was not ready. I was not unready. I was simply in process. Allowing myself to not know yet, which Dr. Simone told me was itself a form of wisdom. My mother's voicemails eventually stopped. I don't know exactly when. I noticed their absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you had grown so used to you stopped registering it. Suddenly, one day, the counter simply stayed at 0 and kept staying there, and I realized it had been staying there for a while. The day I noticed, I was on a walk by the river near my apartment. The February air was cold and clean, and the water was moving fast and silver in the afternoon light. My phone buzzed, and I looked down with the old reflex, the one conditioned by months of watching that counter, and it was just my friend asking what I wanted for dinner. I stopped walking. I stood by the river, and I smiled at my phone like a complete idiot. Then I texted back. And I kept walking. I want to finish this story the way I have tried to live since Aliner died, without performance, without a tidy bow, without the kind of ending that wraps everything into something more comfortable than it actually is. Because the truth is, healing is not a destination. It is not a moment you arrive at where everything clicks into place, and the credits roll and you walk away clean. It is a daily practice. Some days you do it well. Some days you sit in your car in a parking lot and cry over something small that turned out to be something big. Some days you feel completely whole, and some days you feel like the 11-year-old girl crying at her grandmother's kitchen table. And the only difference is that now you know how to sit with both versions of yourself, without either one destroying the other. I want to tell you about the day the Aliner house opened. It was the first Saturday in April. I had flown into Columbus the night before and driven to Clover Falls in the dark, the same highway, the same county line, the same water tower with the fading letters. But I want you to notice something. My shoulders didn't rise this time. My jaw didn't tighten. My breath stayed even all the way through town. The body remembers, yes, but the body also learns. It learns new things when you give it enough time, and enough safety, and enough evidence that the old associations no longer apply. I arrived at Aliner's house, the Aliner house, at 7 in the morning, 2 hours before anyone else. I wanted that time alone. I stood on the front porch in the April morning, and I looked at what had been built. The exterior had been repainted, the same white, the same green shutters, because some things deserved to stay exactly as Aliner had kept them. The rose bushes along the porch had been properly shaped by Carla and were just beginning to bud, small, tight promises of what was coming. The front path had been repaved. A small wooden sign beside the door, simple, unassuming, exactly as I had requested, read the Aliner house in clean carved letters. I stood there for a long time. Then I went inside and walked through every room slowly by myself before anyone arrived. The communal kitchen with its long table and mismatched chairs, deliberately mismatched, because I wanted it to feel like somewhere people actually lived, not an institution. The library, shelves floor to ceiling, stocked with Aliner's own book collections supplemented by donations from the town, including, I was told, 3 boxes of books from Aliner's church circle, dropped off without announcement one morning with a handwritten note that said simply, Aliner would have wanted this. The 6 bedrooms, small, clean, each one with a window and a lamp and a quilt made by a local quilting group who had heard about the project and shown up with donations, and an offer to help that I had accepted immediately. I stood in the smallest bedroom at the back of the house, the one with the window that looked directly out onto Aliner's rose garden, and I thought about the 6 young women who were moving in on Monday. I didn't know their stories yet. I didn't need to. I knew the shape of them, the particular shape of someone who has had to choose between safety and family, and has finally, at great cost, chosen safety. I knew what it felt like to make that choice with nothing but 2 suitcases and $1,400, and the terrifying, necessary conviction that you deserved better than what you were leaving. I wanted them to walk into this house and feel what I had spent 7 years trying to build for myself. The specific, irreplaceable feeling of a space that was entirely, unconditionally, safely yours. The opening was 14 people. Jerome, who had worked 7-day weeks for months, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at what we had built together with an expression that required no words. Patricia, my attorney, who drove up from Columbus and cried twice, and both times looked away and cleared her throat as though that made it less obvious. Mr. Marsh, who came quietly and stood in Aliner's garden for a long time touching the rose bushes gently with the back of his hand. Cassandra, who brought flowers and her notebook and promised she was there as a friend, not a journalist, and then asked if she could write about it later, and I said yes because the story deserved to be told. Dr. Simone, who had flown in from Portland because she said there was no version of this day where she wasn't present, and whose presence made me feel more held than I had words for. Beverly from the shelter, who had become a friend over the months of planning, and who hugged me at the door and said, Aliner would have loved every inch of this. And Aliner's neighbors, her church friends, the librarian she had known for 30 years, people who had loved her quietly and faithfully for decades, who walked through her house slowly with their hands touching the walls and their faces doing the complicated work of grief and gratitude simultaneously. I spoke briefly. I had written something and then thrown it away and written something else and thrown that away too, and eventually decided to just stand in Aliner's kitchen, our kitchen now, and say what was true. I talked about Aliner, about what it means to have one person in your life who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway, not despite your complications, but including them, fully, without condition. About how the most profound acts of love are often the quiet ones. The ones that happen in sewing rooms and attorneys' offices, and 14-month-long preparations that nobody witnesses, but the person they are meant for. About how Aliner had spent the last chapter of her life building something for me with the materials she had, patience, documentation, a notary public, and 30 years of careful saving, and how I was trying to honor that by building something for others with what she had left me. I did not mention my family. Not by name, not by implication. That chapter was closed and this one was open, and I was not going to let the shadow of one fall across the light of the other. The room was quiet when I finished. Then Jerome started clapping, and someone laughed, and Beverly was absolutely not crying, and Dr. Simone squeezed my hand, and the moment broke open into something warm and ordinary and real, which is exactly how the best moments end. I flew back to Portland Sunday evening. Here is where everyone landed, as far as I know. Marcus is in Arizona. He and Dana appear, from what little filters back through mutual acquaintances, to have built a quiet life there. He has not contacted me. I have not contacted him. That distance suits us both, and I hold no anger about it anymore. Anger requires ongoing investment, and I have better things to invest in. My father's 4-page letter is still in the drawer of my nightstand. I have read it 3 times total. I am not ready to respond, and I am not ready to say I never will. I am simply in the honest, uncomfortable, necessary space of not knowing yet, and I have learned to sit there without forcing a resolution in either direction. My mother stopped calling. The voicemails are gone. Whatever she is doing in Clover Falls, she is doing it without me, and I genuinely, quietly, without performance or residual bitterness, wish her whatever peace she is capable of finding. The Aliner house, as of the last update Jerome sent me, has a 3-month waiting list. Aliner's roses bloomed in May. Carla sent me a photograph, full and pink and slightly chaotic, tumbling over the front porch railing in exactly the extravagant way Aliner always let them grow, because she said roses that were too controlled were roses that had forgotten what they were for. I have that photograph as my phone wallpaper. And here is what I want to leave you with, not advice, because I don't think I'm qualified to tell anyone how to live, but just the truth as I have found it. 7 years of silence cost me something real. The grief of it was real. The loneliness of holidays and the complicated ache of watching other people's families from a distance and wondering if you made the right call, all of that was real, and I will not minimize it for the sake of a cleaner story. But 7 years of silence also gave me my life. The actual one. The one where I know who I am separate from who they told me I was. The one where I wake up in my apartment with the plant on the windowsill and the coffee maker running and the absolute, hard-won, unshakable knowledge that I am safe, that I built this, that it is mine. Aliner left me money and property and documentation, and a letter pressed firmly into cream-colored paper. But the most important thing she left me was the proof, concrete, notarized, irrefutable, that I had been right about myself all along. Some nights when the apartment is quiet and the light above the stove is on and the plant is doing well and everything is ordinary and peaceful and entirely mine, I think about that Thursday night in October, the 43 voicemails, the kitchen floor, the small light in the dark. And I think about what I built from that night. And I think, Aliner, look what we did.